PARI for co-organizing this series to help bring some profile to the Africa Care Economy Index, which we launched here in the first item of this series. Today, we are talking about the connections between care and universal basic electricity. It is not a connection that I've made explicitly in the index, but as we know, electricity is key to a lot of caring labor, which, as we know, tends to be done by women. So we want to try and concretize those links through PARI's study, released late last year, Hungry for Electricity, which was co-authored by our main speaker today, Mahlatse Rampedi. Mahlatse is not in the room. There has been some exposure to COVID. Maybe that's why some of the other participants haven't been able to come. So he's doing the right thing and joining in online. And we will also have Hameda Deedat as a respondent, followed by Trevor Ngwane. And I'm really excited to have these two respondents because they go back in my mind some 20 years. I didn't meet Trevor until much later, but many of you will know that he was a key player in the anti-privatization forum. And I read about it back in 2004 and finally met him only in 2012. Hameda is also somebody that I came to know around that time. Hameda was presenting some research on water and the impact of lack of water on women and caring work. So I thought of the two of you as excellent respondents for our topic today. Let me tell you a little bit about Mahlatse. He is a researcher here at PARI in the Energy and Society program. His research interests are politics, repertoire of collective action, and electoral politics. Hameda is a senior researcher in gender, labor, energy, water, and climate change issues. And since 2016, she has served as acting director of NALEDI, which is the research arm of the Congress of South African Trade Unions. She's authored numerous studies and reports over the past 2.5 decades, including the chapter that I worked on her with in this book, The Future of Mining in South Africa. Hameda's chapter is called The Mining Energy Nexus, Climate Change and Prospects for Just Transition, Reflections of a Labor Educator. And that ties in nicely with this edited volume of Trevor, Fourth Industrial Revolution, a Sociological Critique. Trevor has also written Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South African Shack Settlements. It came out in 2021, and he was co-editor of this one. So please check out those publications. A little bit more on Trevor now. Trevor is a scholar activist who has worked with trade unions, community organizations, and other political formations. He continues to be active in the struggle for energy for all. Very fitting, given that we're now in stage 8. Having fun with that. Trevor is also senior lecturer at the UJ Department of Sociology and director of UJ Center for Sociological Research and Practice. So let us get into the main presentation from Mahlatse Rampedi on the Hungry for Electricity report. That will be followed by the 2 respondents, then maybe a few more minutes for Mahlatse, and then we will open up the discussion. Thanks to everybody for being here. Go ahead, Mahlatse.
No, thank you so much for the nice introductions. It's great to have everybody here. Thank you for also inviting us into the care economy seminar series. And it is very great to share ideas, to share work, and to find interesting ways to go forward in understanding the country that we live in and the situations that we found ourselves. So this book that Tracy and I wrote is called Hungry for Electricity. We try to look deeply into electricity and socio-economic development and state development as well. So it's been an interesting journey in going into the field, finding all of these different perspectives, different experiences, and different ways in which people view the government, the way they view their, issues around electricity, and the way we have analyzed and tried to respond to these kind of things. So just to begin, I'd just like to start with just showing exactly what's been going on in the past few years. And if you look at the trajectory of where South Africa is going in terms of access to electricity since 1996, we see that there's been an interesting development of access to electricity, especially since around 2000 and 2003. So, but what has been seen lately is that with the increase that has gone from 2016 to 84%, 2019 going onwards has sort of shown a slight drop in the access that people have with electricity. And this has brought in some challenges for people, and it's sort of affected how they develop, how they maintain their daily lives. So given all of this, all of the access to electricity that is happening in the country, given the book itself, we find that electricity, it's a great enabler of development, as was mentioned earlier here. That we believe that electricity to clean and safe energy, it results in socioeconomic development, which facilitates both higher standards of living as well as higher levels of economic activity. So this high level of electricity consumption, which is quite contradictory to what we've seen since 2019, results in high economic growth. Whereas if it's constrained, it is quite linked to declining economic activity. So access to this affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy is quite linked to attaining many of the sustainable development goals, eradicating poverty, improving food security, addressing climate change, and improving health outcomes. So, we can all agree that this increase in electricity consumption is quite an essential condition for improving people's quality of life. And in fact, it's pretty much almost impossible to imagine life without electricity, or to push forward sustainable development goals, particularly goal number 7, universal access to electricity. So what's been going on is that households and small enterprises in particular, given our current situation, they're able to engage in wider range of economic activity when they have electricity. The small scale, agriculture that provides significantly better financial return and fewer risks when electricity is available. We can look at crop irrigation, for example, for small farmers, particularly in rural areas. So others, you can include things such as retailing for basic food items and preparing ready-made meals. Households that have this kind of electricity or access to electricity are more likely to establish small enterprises. So this is a big challenge for people who live without electricity, because their way or their informal ways of trading or of improving their lives are quite those channels are pretty much closed in a lot of ways. So if you look at some places, especially in townships, one of the biggest cries, especially for informal business people, is that they couldn't open for long, or keep things refrigerated, keep things lasting longer than they actually would. So they tend to lose out in both their nutrition as well, and some of the surpluses that can be invested in other opportunities or other needs. So, I mean, other things that are additional to this, to how important access to electricity is education. People are able to learn better. Children are able to study in the evenings, or to keep things like heat whenever there is whenever they need to study or do other productive things. So this inability to sort of have access to energy sort of forces households to use unsafe sources such as paraffin and coal and other things within the household, just so they can sustain themselves. So in particular, and as part of our theme here, I mean, a lot of women carry a disproportionate burden, particularly in rural areas, in respect to time spent sourcing fuels such as firewood. I mean, it takes quite a while just to make a meal for children, just to find other things, traveling time, spaces that you can move to, or having to find alternatives in the dark, for example. So this is a big issue for single parent homes, single mothers, for example, and the weights that they carry in having to carry on in such a condition. It is something quite difficult to do. So also, we can add that this access to electricity, it increases access to to national and global decarbonization goals. So this one, having to eliminate most of the alternatives that are forced by lack of access to electricity, it leads to much greater benefits than we can even think of, not on an individual level, but on a national and global scale. So it is one of the greatest enablers of the development that we seek. So positively, outcomes that are associated with electricity, they as I mentioned, they are quite wide. Individuals benefit, households benefit, communities benefit, agricultural and other business sectors benefit, and we should see this access to electricity as beneficial for everybody. So we can attain multiple national socio-economic development goals that are broad-based benefits across the society and our entire economy. So in terms of universal access, we don't just mean access to a plug point, but for us, access is quite literally the physical access that we find from the infrastructure that is built for people to access the electricity, plus affordability and reliability of the electricity provided. So in terms of physical access, as mentioned, this would be the infrastructure that is available for people to connect on. And reliability, it would be like the consistent and uninterrupted version of connecting to the electricity grid, something consistent, something that is permanent, and something that is quite reliable. Load shedding is making that fact quite difficult at the moment. And affordability. So it just means the actual users of the electricity. This depends on the ability to pay. So affordability is a great barrier to access to electricity. Even if you have the infrastructure, there is no point in having plug points that nobody can use, infrastructure where electricity is not being channeled. And there's so many disadvantages that go with not being able to afford electricity. So this is one of the crucial things that we'd like to mention, and something that is not really looked at when we're looking at universal access to electricity. So affordability in looking at universal access, as I mentioned, is quite important. By this we mean that it can only be meaningful if energy is genuinely affordable to all users, and I'd like to emphasize all. Enough energy to support significant increase in productivity. So this is because the most significant cost associated with access is not really the initial connection itself. It's the users that follows, how much of it is used, how much of it is also used for other opportunities aside from the immediate ones that usually a lot of people cannot reach. So yeah, so we do realize that affordability, it creates the biggest barrier to access, as I mentioned. So now, in the lack of focus, policy focus to date on affordability, it means that there's not really a clear benchmark or defining what exactly what affordability is. And even though affordability is central to facilitating access to clean and safe energy, it is not really explicitly considered and planned for in most of the strategies that have been adopted in South Africa. So even like we had a bit of a critique on how affordability, the current model of determining affordability, a lot of studies use that the 10% threshold, that people, their household consumption or expenditure should be at 10% of household income spent on electricity. But some studies, have shown that, affordability is a problem if the cost is more than as little as 5%, given that most people are unemployed, a lot of them earn very low incomes, and in some cases, electricity is very, very expensive. So enabling access into electricity in this case is the ultimate goal. So this implies that there's a minimum threshold level of consumption, of reliable and quality electricity that must be reached in order to generate meaningful socioeconomic benefit. So to say, the potential of it, the potential of access to be realized. So this medium, what do you call it? The minimum threshold of level of consumption. This is the minimum consumption that households need to be able to use electricity to increase their living standard and to engage in many economic activities. It is the consumption level every small enterprise can also take advantage of this opportunity. It's not just having access to the infrastructure itself. So this means that all users are able to access the minimum threshold level of consumption. So now the main problem that we've seen is that so many households, they consume so little below the minimum level threshold because they cannot afford more. It's just to get by, just to reach a level where we can consider them as people whose access to electricity can enable them to sustain themselves, to improve themselves, and to alleviate some parts of their poverty. That level is really problematic. And in order to focus on access to electricity so that it can translate into meaningful socioeconomic benefit, it's quite important that we assess the amount required to facilitate improvement in standards of living, to increase such economic opportunities, and to provide new sources of employment, for example. So this is what we mean by enabling access, you know. So because I mean, policies achieving these things will never really develop on their developing potential until they are firmly focused on achieving or enabling access in this way. So we must have a bit of a larger focus on addressing the barriers that prevent users from accessing the minimum threshold of consumption, you know, just to you know, to a level of that they can show tangible development in their lives. So in summary of the first part of this, so we must focus on this goal, you know, and sorry, just to repeat myself here, you know, focusing on enabling this access so that everybody has it, you know, so that, you know, all users are able to consume the quantities of reliable and quality electricity that will increase the level of, I mean, their living standards and create new opportunities. So, I mean, in the past few decades, there has been approaches by this South African states to address this. You know, they've given enough, not really enough, but a considerable amount of understanding into how energy is, as they mentioned here, the lifeblood of development. And they have been saying this since the white paper on energy policy. You know, on paper, they sort of appear, you know, to be committed to making good progress towards universal access to electricity, but so far that has not really been hasn't translated into active strategies right now. So, you know, they believe that the National Electrification Program is making significant contributions to socioeconomic development, and we would like to differ in that regard, you know.
Mahlatse, sorry, 5 more minutes.
5? Oh my God, I need 15 more. Okay. So sorry, just to share. So the reality right now is that although the national, you know, the National Electrification Program has been quite, you know, relatively successful compared to other developing countries. We have one of the highest levels of electrifications on the continent. But regardless, real progress has not really been limited, you know, because, you know, this goes back as well to the problem of affordability, and a lot of this has been mentioned by the white paper on energy and the white paper on local government as a big concern. So, and now millions of South African households do not have the kind of electricity that could change their lives. You know, we have connections, but we cannot afford to use them, or we can only use a tiny amount of electricity in that particular case. So what now the electrification problem seems to be failing to some level, because, you know, we have the infrastructure, but we don't have the means or the affordability or enough of the access for us to actually give ourselves a fighting chance in socioeconomic development. So that was a missed opportunity, a very, you know, big missed opportunity, because if access and affordability had been properly considered when most of these policies were being introduced and implemented, things would have been quite different, you know. So if people cannot really use the electricity to facilitate improvements in their lives, you know, none of the current policies and strategies in respect to this kind of access will ever change this, because it's just shooting ourselves in the foot to some level. So Just to make things quite quick, I think I'm gonna pass this one. So now there's we have like instead we have electricity. I mean, we have energy policy that depends poverty and inequality. I'm gonna just mention to share the policy to promote universal enabling access, as I mentioned before. They focused a lot on giving the electricity and not particularly the second part where electricity is universal as well. They've sort of focused a lot on providing the importance of reliable and affordable electricity in mining industry, big business, etc. But they have completely ignored low-income households and small and micro enterprises and small farmers. So essentially, the state is neglecting exactly the same people where the positive impact of electricity would be happening. So this tends to now, the energy policy tends to now it positions itself in a place where it exacerbates inequality. So after the white paper, there was the National Energy Act, and so this one is intended to deliver the objective of the white paper as mentioned before, including affordable access for households and other small businesses. But it contains no detail on how to determine whether electricity tariff is affordable, nor does it set any benchmark or targets for affordability. Therefore, affordability went out the window again. It didn't really do anything to advance this goal, and later, it shifts the responsibility of understanding affordability to the integrated energy plan, with the energy plan as well failing dismally to make progress in terms of achieving the goal of affordability. It also doesn't have the benchmark for assessing whether energy service is in fact affordable. There's no oversight mechanism, to monitor the realization of this universal access to energy. So people are just living blissfully. And in the past 20 years, although we've been providing some ways for people to plug points onto the electricity, we haven't given, the state hasn't given any indication on how to understand how people can afford this electricity to improve their lives. So cross-subsidization and fee-basic electricity policy, they sort of made things slightly better, but not really. So now that the people who have with higher incomes now would be subsidizing those with low incomes with cross-subsidization, and free basic electricity would be giving people about 50 kilowatt hours of free electricity every month. So, the policy is useful in conception, but has been a failure in implementation. It's completely inadequate to our situation. And now millions of households are excluded from the very thing that would increase their standards of living. About 11 people were supposed to be getting this free basic electricity, but the number is just about 9. So as I know, it's about 3 million people. So it's less than 35% of people are getting this, and it should have been implemented a long time ago with a proper understanding of exactly how this can supplement the minimum threshold level of consumption. So the other one, and then there's policies that are, actively eroding enabling access, especially the user pays the cost recovery model. So this one, it requires that the full cost of providing a service is paid by the households, by the communities, by the users of that service, and a significant number of users cannot afford the cost recovery based electricity tariff, even if it has been subsidized but through charging other users higher tariffs. So it shows that, some other research shows that, poor households constitute more than half of South African households. They, some usually regularly borrow money to pay for this for these costs, for this increasing electricity costs as a result. So now, I mean, the potential pathways of poverty, are hindered, and enabling access to electricity is hindered as well. And millions of poor households are then permanently trapped in poverty. So this is a very poor policy choice in our view, because it does exactly the opposite of what the state intended with the energy policy, that universal access to electricity would provide a pathway out of poverty for people. So yeah, so now all the pathways are pretty much closed. And when a situation is like this, and a lot of people cannot really work with state policies that were originally envisioned to improve their socioeconomic standards. So even like looking at the local government fiscal framework, so this one, because like the municipalities have no discretion in reducing cost, and they cannot have unfunded budgets, electricity revenue is the single best category for municipal revenue. So increases in electricity charges now becomes the main tool for the municipality to balance their books, to make to increase their budgets to some level. So we can see that that the state their policy now is clearly on maximizing the flow of electricity revenue and not leveraging its development potential. So while and most of this sort of like maximizing electricity revenue, it's in some cases is quite punitive. People are getting disconnected. Electricity is increasing pretty much every year. Every year. Please let me know again about the time. I'm not going to take too long. So what we find here is it's a vicious cycle of poverty and energy poverty that is created now and pretty much entrenched by the state, because its policies and strategies are trapping a large percentage of South African within energy poverty. So what we've seen lately, I mean, I don't know how many people I have spoken to that both who have electricity and who do not have electricity connecting, for example, illegally. Some try to find different sources such as coal, firewood, primarily for cooking. It's causing like indoor pollution, and this has been a big problem for most women and children who, especially in the winter, having to keep warm. It's coming into the winter now, and the conversation of electricity is going to be very important for most women and most children. So other things that we can include in this milieu of difficulty is the high cost of consistent reconnecting. People think that connecting illegally is free or cheap, or there's so many costs in connect. There's renting lines, there's fuses blowing everywhere. People lose their lives with electrocutions. People have seen communities or households with lots of appliances that are not working. A lot of them short-circuited because of electricity problems. So the cost of living is sort of a bit high for people living without electricity, because finding alternative, both in terms of finances, in terms of time, in terms of, I suppose, space, is something that is a huge cost for people living without electricity, something that could actually be solved by developmental thinking in terms of how and how much people consume this kind of electricity. So we believe that universal enabling access to electricity must be a national development priority. It is the most effective strategy for South Africa to make a meaningful impact on poverty and inequality. It will contribute to higher standards of living and facilitate millions of economic and employment opportunities, and would also leverage and improve the impact of electricity on people's livelihoods. So it shouldn't be in a situation where the electricity provision is in the sense that if somebody is poor, they cannot have electricity. This is quite astonishingly short-sighted. It ensures that poverty will never really be addressed, since poor households are deprived of the opportunity to increase their standards of living. So by ensuring that a household, particularly poor households, will never be able to reach their minimum threshold level of consumption, some of these policies, they completely entrench inequality. And if you look at it, some historically poor areas, particularly townships, the barriers to the access to electricity remains, the barriers remain quite as high as they were before. So now development hasn't really been realized as much as we would like. So what exactly would universal enabled access to electricity look like when it is achieved? So now going back to having physical access, quality and reliable supply, and then the affordability of the medium threshold. And so to meet these things, electricity or expenditure on such electricity shouldn't erode household expenditure needed for other critical poverty reduction expenditure, especially food. Because households that have pressing demands will not be able to afford these kind of things. And those households that are already food insecure usually divert the expenditure from food to fund their own payment portion of electricity. So it is still a huge issue in terms of looking at how we look at affordability when people have to relinquish some of their incomes to cover for increasing levels of electricity and electricity access. So in conclusion, one, as mentioned before, that electricity is quite key to reducing poverty. It is our greatest enabler of socioeconomic transformation. And the concept of universal enabled electricity goes far beyond the physical connections that we see. It shows that even if electricity is there, there is a minimum level of electricity which is necessary to generate socioeconomic development benefit. And this insistence that if you cannot pay, you can't get electricity, it discriminates, against those citizens, that the post-apartheid state promised to do the most for, the poor in general, poor Black women in particular. Essentially, they cannot pay what they don't have. So, in that the current model is quite problematic, of electricity provision, which views electricity primarily as a service to be paid for rather than a driver of socioeconomic development. This quite policy is very at odds with its development goals.
Please wrap up, Mahlatse.
Yeah, 30 seconds. So, so just to say that our current approach right now, given it how it's structured, it is beneficial for no one. It keeps millions of people trapped in poverty. Local government, because of the fiscal framework, is stuck in a cycle of financial distress and imposes significant costs on Eskom that it certainly cannot afford. So lastly, we need a developmental model of electricity provision, a model that is generally developmental in nature, not one that actively erodes all possibility of equitable development. So we need a model that reflects South Africa's reality, instead of romanticizing the situation where the only obstacle to electricity access is the willingness of poor households to pay. So essentially, a policy that can maximum the likelihood that every user can consistently access the minimum threshold level of consumptions, of which is such.
Thank you,
to be about
Mahlatse.
350 kilowatts power. All right, thank you. That was words. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought you said over to you.
No, thank you. That's all done. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for giving me your time.
Thank you. Let us go straight to Hameda, given our time.
Oh, thanks very much. And thank you very much to PARI and to you, Salimah, for this opportunity. I must say, Mahlatse, thank you so much for your piece. And I'm going to be slightly controversial, which I usually am as Labour, but also as an activist. Maybe firstly to say, I don't think we're hungry for electricity anymore. I think we're starving. And I think, you know, I think noting your piece, you know, you obviously wrote it within a particular context, but I think we're currently confronted with a particular electricity crisis. And I think, you know, both myself and Trevor historically, and I think even now more so, have been contesting the privatization of electricity. And I think it would be really important when you presenting on the context of electricity in South Africa to look at, I mean, you make reference to, for example, the issue of cost recovery, but where it's not just cost recovery anymore. It's become privatization in its most brutal form. And we know from, particularly from a gender analysis, but also if you're looking at issues in relation to austerity, if you're looking at questions of recession, if you're looking at who are the ones who actually suffer the most when a state is failing, its people, it would largely be women. So I think, you know, as much as you've made reference to the poor, and you speak to the issues of the SDGs, I think you know, really teasing out what the implications are, not just for rural women, but for urban women in particular, and how load shedding and the inability of us to maintain our infrastructure, and how load shedding of between 8 and 12 hours has fundamentally transformed the lives of women and children in particular. Not to say that other people in society aren't affected, but we know that when it comes to the care economy and when it comes to the social reproductive space, when there's a shortage of anything, electricity, water, healthcare, and where the state in particular is failing, the responsibilities largely sit on the shoulders of women. And why this is problematic in the South African context, and I think in the African context in particular, is that we know as part of the developing world, we are failing fundamentally in providing, to your point in relation to SDGs, which speak to the issues of health, water, electricity, food, housing, and so on. And the moment the state fails and continues to fail, and then chooses privatization, commercialization, and cost recovery as its way forward, the burden that it places on women would increase. So I think we really need to, in your analysis, and I think even when you talk about the possibilities of universal electricity, I mean, in our current context, the possibility of a universal access to electricity has become further and further you know, something that we can aspire towards, based on the realities of where the state is going. We've currently unbundled Eskom, and we're attracting, or government has basically wanting to attract massive amounts of funding through donor funding, to the tune of 8.5 billion and 1.5 trillion, which doesn't speak in any way to how it's fundamentally going to address the fundamental inequalities that we see in society, and how this is actually going to address the kinds of issues that women are facing. So if we just take where we're sitting in relation to electricity at the moment, and if you draw on the care index that Salimah had drawn up, looking at the amount of time that women spend in the social reproductive space, if you're sitting without electricity for between 8 and 12 hours, it means even women in urban areas are now having to find alternative forms of electricity. We've seen in informal households or within informal townships, how when people actually use paraffin or coal or wood as an alternative source of electricity, how many shacks have just burnt down, how many people have lost their lives. We've also seen there's a direct relationship between water and electricity. And in many instances, we're finding that in urban townships as well as in rural areas, that because pumping stations can no longer work because of the failure of either the municipality to plan in the context of load shedding, you have the quality of the water being compromised, but you're also finding that people are no longer having access to water for up to 5 days. So the major implication for women in terms of care work would be that they would be spending a lot more time having to deal with finding other water sources, managing the water source, and then on top of that, having to deal with the electricity. I think when you talk about households who, for example, in the context of a public health sector that is also substantively ailing, care has fallen on the shoulders of women, but care in the context of no water and no electricity further exacerbates it. I think, recently there was a court case which argued that hospitals, the police stations, and I think schools should be exempted from load shedding. Praveen Gordhan has come back and contested on behalf of the state, saying in actual fact, he believes that this shouldn't be the case. But can you imagine when children aren't at school, what are the responsibilities placed on women, both in terms of the care economy? Because firstly, it means that when teachers are having to catch up with the work, the responsibilities automatically fall on the shoulders of the household, and it means that it's women that are having to engage and become teachers, because how do you catch up with the amount of hours that we'd never be able to make up in a year? COVID has already damaged us, and load shedding is further exacerbating it. To add insult to injury, we obviously have the issue of crime. So from a public sector perspective, I think the ratio of police persons to South African citizens is 1:300. Now, can you imagine in the context of load shedding, how many women are going to be subjected to either rape, robbery, and other forms of crime, and also mental challenges because of the high, particularly in Gauteng, when generally security is an issue, but when you're sitting without electricity and without water, and you made mention to single households, I mean, the burden of care and responsibility of taking care of your family outside of having electricity within poor communities, as well as those where the security is not, where the places are just not safe, it's actually going to heighten not only crime, but the kinds of gender-based violence that women are going to be subjected to. So, I mean, I think that, while you've raised really, really critical issues in general in relation to the policy, in relation to our aspirations, and the fact that the current macroeconomic framework that we're focusing on is not going to meet the demands of achieving the universal access, I think it would be important to state that when we consciously choose to make policy decisions or to follow a macroeconomic paradigm that is supporting privatization and creating systems where women in particular, or households in particular, are being left without what is known as a public good, both in terms of water and electricity, there's no way that we are going to be fundamentally addressing the major inequalities that we see in society. And that it's not just the feminization of poverty in relation to rands, but it's actually the feminization of I think of gender-based violence. I think the feminization of the way in which society is just ripping ripping apart our social fiber and increasing the responsibilities that are being placed on women. So I think it's really, really, really important that when we advance the policies and we're articulating for alternatives, that we have to do this taking into consideration the social reproductive space, and definitely how it is that we want to fundamentally change the lives of women. I think I'd also just want to end up by saying that, when we look at when you approach a policy piece from a gendered perspective, for those of us who articulate this position, we always say it's not that we exclude men, but usually when you fundamentally transform the lives of women, the multiplier effects on society as a whole, but also on the household, is fundamentally transformed. So I think it would be really useful if you can juxtapose your conclusions, and I think some of the recommendations that you make from that perspective. But I really want to appreciate the work that you've put in, as well as the analysis and the critique that you've given in relation to the lack of access, the hunger, which I now refer to as starvation, and the inability of the state to fundamentally transform our electricity access and policy to change people's lives. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hameda. You covered almost everything I wanted to say. So let's go straight to Trevor Ngwane.
Thank you very much. So let me thank Mahlatse and Tracy for a great report. I think the report, the trust, is about free basic electricity for all. It boils down to that, although more generally, energy for all. Yeah. And I think, you know, looking at this work by Salimah, I think free energy, well, energy for all is an essential aspect of a care economy. And I want to keep on talking about caring and sharing, because I think what we need from a general or broad point of view is an economy which is caring for people, an economy which is sharing the resources of society. So Mahlatse is saying we need clean, safe, reliable, and affordable energy. So there are various aspects which really hit me. So I'll refer to some of those highlights. But I do agree strongly with Hameda and Mahlatse actually on the importance of energy in social reproduction and how most of the time, you know, the burden of energy poverty, load shedding, you know, lies on women for reasons, you know, which we must still fight. Yeah, so what I like about the report is that unequivocally, Mahlatse and Tracy are saying we need, and they put a figure, we need 350 kilowatt hour of free electricity per household per month in South Africa. At the moment, government policy is 50 kilowatt hour, which is too little. And then also they point out how municipalities have been allowed, you know, to do what they like, basically, with this policy. Remember, in Johannesburg, with Mashaba, he changed it from free for all to free for only those who are indigent. And then you have to queue and fill forms proving how destitute you are. So, and then also what they do, Mahlatse and Tracy, is to put a figure on how much this would cost for the South African taxpayer, for the treasurer. So I don't know if I wrote it down here, but I think they said 81 billion. Yeah, 81 billion. And then okay, it's probably 60. Yeah, so the radio announcer was well-meaning, but she couldn't understand this idea of free electricity, because I think she thinks that anything that is free, mahala, somehow it's a fantastic idea. So I said, but the policy is there. And then once she got around to that, so now I had to argue that instead of 50 kilowatt hour, give them, I don't know, maybe I had already read this, because I said 350 kilowatt hour. Oops. But I was struggling in my head whether it was the right figure. But I had to say something. So, and it turns out, yes, that's what Mahlatse and them are saying. Yeah. So now I'm saying that that shows that ordinary people, or maybe radio journalists, you know, need exposure, and such a report might work. Yes. And then the next step, of course, is that the government itself is neoliberal. So it's also opposed to these policies. For example, Mashaba, he scrapped free basic electricity in Johannesburg, replacing it with an indigency policy, you see. And then also local government throughout the country, they are actually not spending money for free basic electricity called the equitable share from Treasury, from National Treasury. They're spending it on other things because free electricity seems like a pipe dream, you see. Of course, it doesn't help the fact that we've got an energy crisis. So it's almost like, hey, if everyone is suffering, the poor must suffer more. I mean, that's natural, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So, and then another problem is that of arithmetic. So, because somewhere, it's a pity I didn't, oh yeah, so there is a definition where Mahlatse and Tracy, I'm right, it's written by Tracy, Leger, and yeah. Okay, so Mahlatse and Tracy, somewhere they define energy poverty. So they say, you know, it's a lack of access to sustainable modern energy sources and products. Then they say this definition is both quantitative and qualitative. So in terms of it must be clean, safe energy, and there must be lots of it, or adequate amounts of it. So it got me thinking, because me, I'm a Marxist. You know, Marx talks about there is quantitative change, but enough of that, it changes into qualitative change. So from arithmetic to caring and sharing. And when we say power to the people, we mean real power, let alone energy, electricity. Take the power away from the, I don't know, the bourgeoisie or whoever is monopolizing everything today. And then in some research we did at UJ, we found that because, you know, Mahlatse is going on about energy poverty. So we found that energy poverty, we also looked at energy insecurity. So we found that these were inadequate for what we found in our research. So we came up with the concept of energy racism, which we felt it was more in South Africa. So energy racism is based on, okay, yes, on energy poverty. So that's how we arrived at this. So it's like energy racism. South Africa, it's a racial capitalist state. You know, that's what it was a capitalist. And then it's to the democratic state. You know, living in South countries which were created as labor, you know, dormitories for black people. ESCOM, they've got 2 programs of load shedding for everyone, and a special one called load reduction for black working class areas. Yeah. So that's how we came to energy racism. Also, for many years historically, if you take Soweto, people had a power station, Orlando power station, but they were living in darkness. So the only thing they benefited was the fumes, you know. So, and what happened is that workers who dig out the coal were black people, cheap labor. They go home, there's no electricity. Now, with the new government, everyone is saying, now we're going to get electricity. Now I've been told stories. So that's how we came to energy racism. And then my last, a related point is ecological challenges, you know, climate change, which are closely related to energy. So I won't elaborate, I think you will know. But one point a friend of mine made was that during the extreme weather patterns in Durban, the Durban floods, all the people who died were there. So it's like that, yeah, which is amazing. Like 443 people. So, you know, that's because of environmental racism, because of exposure to, you know, the acts of God. If you are poor, you know, yeah, that's what happens, yeah. And then, so lastly, it's important, of course, to campaign for energy for all. And I think that this document can be a real good tool for that. You know, it's specific, it's clear, and it's clear in these recommendations. And then, of course, it also refers to past policies like RDP. Can you see? Yeah. And I think what I can say, maybe because I heard Hameda recommending some changes, maybe to tie it even more closely to the economy of caring and sharing. Yeah, then that could make it even more strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor, Hameda, and Mahlatse. Can we, with our last 9 minutes, rather than going back to you, Mahlatse, can we take some questions and points from the other participants?
We've got a few comments from the chat. So can I just go ahead and read them?
Please do, given how much you have been suffering.
Yeah. Sorry.
So, yeah, please.
I'll read one and then we can see if there's any other comments and we can go back to the chat. So David Jeffrey is saying super interesting, thanks. 3 questions. Why has the implementation of free basic electricity failed? Who are the 15% with no access to electricity? What's your policy recommendation for addressing affordability as a barrier? And then goes on a bit later saying, just read the policy recommendation chapter of the report, which is detailed and clear. It looks like this can't be realized unless the funding model for local government changes. So this is one set of comments. If there's anything else from the room, and then we can go back to the chat.
Yes, let's please collect the questions. Anybody here?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Kelly Mabasa. I'm with a small NGO called IDISA, the National Disarmament Initiative of South Africa.
You didn't bring your daughters today.
Come again?
Your daughter?
Yeah, they engage on one plays rugby and the other one plays something else. So
Thank you for
thank you so much. Yeah. So quickly, anyway, brilliant inputs. I like them. But sitting with Dr. Rati, with the doctor here, the first person I will say to the doctor is, does your new definition, the energy racism,
Yes,
encompasses the financial aspect? Does that include, for instance, in Soweto, if you inherit a house, you already inherited that your great-grand have accumulated primarily for electricity, etc. I don't know if that makes sense. But quickly, another thing is the research that are being presented. For me, as much as I spread, who cares? Who reads? What's going to happen? You understand what I'm saying? Does policymakers take all these documents? Do they even read them? Do they even understand? You know, so again, let me just hold it back.
Excellent.
Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you.
on that last question, if I
Yeah.
may. I just want to invite Mahlatse to talk about how this has informed the work of the Auditor General, and also the work of the Presidential Climate Commission, and some of what has gone into the JP that's come out of this work that we do.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, Mbongsen, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear you properly. Your sound is a bit sketchy.
Sorry, Mahlatse, I was just inviting you to share some of the ways, or the ways in which your recommendations have been taken up, and how they've informed somewhat the work of the Auditor General and also the work of the JSP.
And before we conclude, there's another comment, if I can just read it, from Elroy Paulus, and it says that Trevor's input is borne out by long-standing concerns. COSATU warned and opposed the current situation almost 20 years ago. And I guess this is a comment. as well as an invitation to read Mahlatse's and Hameda's inputs and compare them to the government's energy strategy. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's have a round then of responses, starting with Mahlatse. Uh-oh. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'd like to apologize again for everybody. It's gonna be a very funny video to look back and see people in a round table speaking about access to electricity while getting cut off like every. So the irony of it is quite remarkable. So I'm gonna start with my first respondent. This one is yeah, you did go very controversial about having to look at some of the policy strategies in a gendered way, in a gendered way. I think you're completely right. Well, I mean, our study, although it looked at many households, we never really focused particularly on in quite good detail on how this affects women in the care economy. The burden for women is crazy, honestly. I'm looking at everything from crime to how water is being consumed, how it's being collected, how it's being preserved. Looking at how having childcare, for example, and in terms of electricity or lack thereof. I mean, this has to be, I mean, a whole a whole category of work can be done, just particularly on women who have no access to electricity in that regard. So these are very great input from your side. Yeah, so I suppose in going forward, this will be something that we can actually look at, and I think it will give us a different perspective on exactly how affordability can be calculated, can be looked at, and how deeply it can be analyzed to see exactly how affordability is for not only poor households, but for particularly in women in rural and semi-urban areas, for example. So and Trevor, yeah, I like your comments. I like how you usually come with a very Marxist approach to things. I like the concept of energy racism, and I'm just like the other people in the other members in the group there. I would like you to sort of like elaborate a bit more on that, on energy racism. It's a very complex issue, and you sort of walk hand in hand with the way we try to develop on energy poverty in particular. So yeah, if you can go on that, I would have liked to gotten a bit more detailed what do you call questions about, I mean, recommendations. I'm gonna look at David Jeffries as well here. So this one, the recommendations are quite particular. We try to, take the state back into looking at the way that the free basic electricity is sort of analyzed and it's sort of provided, and how some of the indigent policies are sort of driven around this free basic energy. So give me 1 second. So I don't know, I feel like some Jeffrey's comments sort of answered themselves to some level instead of repeating the same thing.
So one bit that wasn't answered in the report was the implementation challenges of free basic electricity. I assume it's because municipalities don't want to put people on indigent lists because they want the revenue. But if there's anything else that has led to FBE being a failure.
Even that is just, if you look at like the way they are doing it, it's just quite tedious and quite not really working, because I mean electricity is provided by Eskom, and if people are not, I mean the indigent register is sort of run by the municipality and is poorly run in that regard. People have to, the municipality has to go to people, and they have criteria for registering people on the indigent, and they've done this very poorly. Some people who are provided by, I mean, electricity is provided by Eskom, they literally have to sort of apply to be put onto the indigent register, which as well is quite problematic. And a lot of people either do not know how or don't have the means to do so, or there isn't really a lot of response from some municipalities. So it's quite a bit of a complex thing where a third of the envisioned people that would be receiving free electricity are sort of left out of the situation. And now, and the poverty for energy continues, and there isn't really a significant way to actually implement the free basic electricity policy.
Okay, we are at our time. If people are okay to go on for another 10 minutes, I see 10 people online.
And I think Hameda has got their hand up, right?
Yes, okay, let's have Hameda next, and then Trevor. Maybe others can put up their hands if 10 more minutes is okay. And online?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh,
Please go ahead, Hameda.
Thanks. It's David, you're around. So I think that it more than what Mahlatse is saying. I think, I did work on free basic water. And the first problem is the progressive block tariff is actually regressive. I mean, when you look at the way in which they're charging, firstly, businesses are highly subsidized. And then when you look at what is expected from the tariff in relation to subsidization, when you look at the bottom number of people that are actually requiring to be subsidized, there's no way that the block tariff is going to achieve it. So the intent is always good, but the mechanisms that they're using to actually set up a subsidization process to facilitate free basic electricity was not possible. That's the first point. And you can look at the World Bank's research in relation to how progressive block tariffs are actually regressive, and that the cost recovery model is actually, and the antithesis of actually giving free basic electricity. I think the second issue was also when municipalities do cost recovery, there's a direct correlation between electricity cutoffs and other services. So there were certain bylaws that municipalities introduced where if you were not paying your water, they would then cut off electricity. So even in terms of people's general access to electricity, despite the fact that you might have a connection, doesn't automatically mean that you have electricity. And I remember, I think it was in 2010 or 2012, when we started looking at the issues of cost recovery and municipal services like water and electricity. Poor households proportionately spend more of their household income towards water and electricity than other households. So there's the framing is fundamentally flawed. You can't move towards understanding or wanting to articulate that there's a public good when the macroeconomic framework you're following is in the antithesis. So I think those are some of the fundamental reasons. And then I think recently the inability and incompetencies within the municipalities currently to even try and achieve, I mean, we're not even talking about free basic electricity. They can't just keep the lights on. So, the possibilities of actually reaching universal access from a framing of it being a public good is fundamentally flawed. So yeah, I mean, in terms of concluding, I just wanted to, when Fidel Castro first became the president of Cuba, the first thing he did was bought every single woman a washing machine. I mean, it's an anecdote, but I think he fundamentally recognized that by giving women a washing machine, it fundamentally transformed their lives, because it meant that the amount of time that they were spending in collecting water, heating the water, doing, spending, washing, etc., gave them time to spend with their families and to be able to do other things. If you want a society to be transformed, women are the first teachers. If you educate your women, they're mothers, they teach their children, they work in the labor market. And we've seen that the multiplier effects when women are educated and when women have access, it transforms an entire society. So I think, and Mahlatse, I would really appreciate the fact that you've taken on board not a critique, but just a different analysis, and I would be most welcome. I mean, I'd welcome a conversation if you'd like to have one. I mean, there's also the concept of a so-called just transition. It's a labor perspective, and again, you cannot do a just transition within the context of climate change without actually doing it from a gendered perspective. I think there's opportunities that await us. It's how we actually take advantage of it. Thank you very much, and thanks again for the opportunity to be able to engage.
No,
Thank
that's
you, Hameda.
just one last word.
No. Now it's Trevor's last word, please.
Okay, sorry, Mahlatse. Yeah, so on, I don't know, Jeffrey's point, another issue to consider is that from the national budget, only 10% goes to local government. So basically, local government is starved of funding. Yeah. So there's this whole thing about how local government is corrupt. Yes, it's true. So we have to deal with that. But essentially, they don't have money to run the municipalities. The only municipalities which are doing any good from general point of view are the big metros. Smaller towns, and even the big metros, they rely on selling water and electricity to balance their books. Johannesburg, it's got something called an operational markup for water and electricity. 72%, 100%. Can you see? So that's the way it goes. And someone did some research and showed that over the last 25 years, these municipalities that the tariff increase for water and electricity is something like 1,000%. So, you know, public goods, you know, which people need to survive, you know, are used as income generating. So that's actually wrong. So it goes back to that neoliberal model of government, not only local government, but national government. So that's what we have to move away from. Of course, it's a fact also, just aside on this free basic electricity. I'm sorry, but everything the ANC touches tends to dust. Yeah, it turns into dust. We know that. Just method it up, you know, I don't know, anything which can go wrong will go wrong. And then on energy raising, it's a very good point. Thank you, yeah, comrade, because that's exactly what people are complaining about, you know. They inherit debt, they inherit poor infrastructure, dilapidated, and then suddenly the transformers, the substations, they blow, and Eskom says, hey, you know very well we don't have money, we're broke. And then people stay without electricity for weeks, months, even years on end. So that's part of energy racism, because the infrastructure is old, it's not serviced, it's neglected, the same way that Eskom neglects its power stations. So the working class and the poor, these areas are not a priority. Go to anywhere and they'll tell you, if something blows in Santi one day, the next day, they're told by their managers directly. Yeah. And then on that important question about who is this report for, I think it must reach the policymakers. But I know with these policymakers, you know, it's like being an advisor to the minister. The minister, they pick and choose. Oh, I like that advice, I don't like that one. So the best thing is to use the report to build community power, community knowledge, so that people can use these arguments, these ideas, you know, to put up a fight, so that we force the government to do the right thing. And then, just like we are talking about gender, you know, in neglected women, gender relations, it's the same with race. Yeah, black people still need to be supported because they suffer kind of apartheid. The fact that some of them have become an aspirant black bourgeoisie, some of them, like myself, are now bearing money as a middle class. The vast majority, 50% of black people are poor. They live on the verge of the poverty. They need all the support they can get. So that is how and why concepts like energy racism come in to provoke that debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take 1 minute to try and summarize the key points in my perspective, of course. 1, racial capitalism continues. That structure of the state and capital has to be dismantled if we want a society based on caring and sharing. So it's not only electricity, it is power, caring, and sharing that are missing. Power to the people. Women carry the burden of this structure of inequality, the way the state and capital function. Women carry the burden. And so, as Hameda is saying, if we think about that greatest burden, and they are Black women, they are mainly Black women. Black people are the majority of this country. If we think about change from the perspective of that woman, we will come up with this program for caring and sharing. If we mobilize around this type of package of changes, we will create the popular understanding and determination. This is all about radical reform, right? To move to the next phase, which is actually dismantling the structure. Because these radical reforms are not possible under a neoliberal capitalist state. But people don't understand that. Largely, people are still working on single issues, right? And we're not uniting. In that way, we don't challenge the state. Even if, sorry, Mominseni, our recommendations come into some official policy positions, it doesn't actually change what's happening on the ground. So with that, let me close the